Hey everyone, and welcome back to another fantasy battle video. So this is one of the hardest fantasy battle videos that I've ever made, and it's because it's putting two of my all-time favorite characters against each other. Not only that, but they're also father and son, and they pretty much have the same fighting style. This is going to be a long video, but it's going to be full of details, full of analysis, and full of overall abilities to be able to assess who would actually win in a fight. So before we get started, hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and check me out on Spotify because I'll also have this episode up with a lot of sound effects and added details. So this is a battle for the ages. Luke versus Anakin, son versus father, both in their youth. The tricky part with this fantasy battle is that Anakin never got to see his prime. So what do we do here? Do we manipulate this battle to be perhaps Anakin not having lost to Obi-Wan and reaching his full potential, then going up against Legends Luke, who is extremely powerful as well? Or do we go realistic? Anakin Skywalker in Revenge of the Sith against Luke in The Mandalorian Season 2 against the Dark Troopers. I'm gonna make this one more of a realistic kind. Now keep in mind, these are two of my favorite characters, so the bias is pushed aside. Let's begin with Luke. Luke used many different lightsaber fighting styles. He ended up most comfortable with Anakin's Form 5, Dem So. So right off the bat, it's going to be hard to compare their fighting styles because, well, much of it is very similar, and there's a reason that I'm not saying it's the same, and I'll get to that in a minute. Dem So is much more of an aggressive and offensive type of attack compared to Obi-Wan's Sarisu, which is primarily for defense, or let's say Yoda's Ataru, which is mainly focused on speed and aggression through jumps and acrobatics. Form 5 was more pushy, in the sense that the user would constantly attack the opponent, rarely really being on the offensive. Now, Form 5 demanded a lot of physical strength, and since both Luke and Anakin were pretty jacked and pretty shredded, this proves no issue for them, or their stamina. The advantage Luke would have is that he's used more fighting styles than Anakin. He's used many different ones and incorporated more styles into his usual Form 5. Now, Anakin did this as well, and he was also practicing with dual blades. And that's not to be confused with a double-bladed lightsaber, but dual blades like against Count Dooku in Attack of the Clones. Now, I believe Luke melded more of these various styles into his overall fighting style, kind of making a rainbow effect of, a fighting style, essentially just mixing it up a lot, kind of like MMA. This made him a little bit more of an unpredictable fighter. Now, I'm going to get to Anakin's in a minute, so don't worry, but we have a little more about Luke's that we need to talk about. Luke's been a Jedi for only just about 10 years. Anakin has been a Jedi for 13 years. He's learned lightsaber combat from many masters and has more combat experience than Luke. I mean, Clone Wars alone is just enough of a resume. Anakin has fought Dooku, Obi-Wan, Asajj Ventress, and so much more. He's overpowered the son of Mortis, the daughter, by controlling them, and he was trained in what I like to call proper combat at the temple and through the Clone Wars. He learned and he visually witnessed masters like Yoda, Mace Windu, Obi-Wan, Sindralig, and many more, which aided in his overall experience and fighting career. Whereas Luke had to learn by himself, on his own in comparison. Who taught him lightsaber combat after Return of the Jedi? The Force Ghosts? I mean, if they did, then that's a big advantage. But it's possible that no one did, and he had to just learn things himself. That being said, even if he learned from the Ghosts, none of it will be as hands-on as actually fighting Sith Lords in their prime like Anakin did with Dooku and beating him. The only advantage I could see here is that Luke is a much more calm and collected Force user in The Mandalorian than Anakin was in Revenge of the Sith. I believe Anakin was more powerful, but Luke was more calm, collected, and not to mention older than Anakin. Mentally, this is a big thing for guys at that age. The difference between 22 and 28 is vastly different. It's much more than just 6 years. Even speaking from experience, age 22 to 28, I was a completely different person at both of those ages. And I think a lot of us can attest to the same thing. Luke would be 28, whereas Anakin was 22. So this puts them pretty even for the amount of training that they've had, while Anakin trained a little longer. Now, Annie had the Jedi Masters, whereas Luke did a lot of trial and error himself. Now, of course, Luke did learn from the Force Ghosts, I'm assuming, and why wouldn't he? And from holocrons and texts and things like that he scoured through the galaxy over these next 5 years after Return of the Jedi. So one approach is more applied, like Anakin's, while the other is a little bit more theory, which is Luke's. Anakin at the end of Revenge of the Sith was his most powerful state before being chopped up. This was also his most arrogant and foolhardy phase. He had just unlocked all these new powers and didn't know how to control them. Luke was more calm, more level-headed. And while I believe Anakin was more experienced physically, Luke was more experienced mentally with controlling his emotions. One uses the dark side, the other uses the light. It's a difficult scenario to analyze as both fighters are related, so it's not really too easy. Now, Anakin's fighting abilities, I think, were much superior to Luke's. The way he fought, the way he moved, his overall fluidity with his fighting techniques were just much better than Luke's. And this is why I give the fighting style to Anakin. Next, let's examine Force powers. Anakin's Force potential was farther than Luke's. He was the chosen one. He will always reach a higher potential than anyone else in Star Wars. But we know that's not how it ended for Anakin. This is where the battle analysis gets really confusing. Anakin's Force powers at this time were somewhat matched to Obi-Wan's. As we can see, when they tried to push each other, they were sort of in a stalemate. Now Luke's at this time, his powers are much stronger than Obi-Wan's were. It's very hard to compare it like that, as Anakin did many things that Obi-Wan could never do, like the events on Mortis, for example. Anakin's powers were the Chosen One's powers. This meant that he had an infinite reserve of power. The longer he fought, especially, let me just say it twice, if he was in the dark side. His emotions were propelled further and further as he got more and more angry. Luke's powers were epic in The Mandalorian, don't get me wrong. I cried my eyes out when I saw him. But we also saw Vader do something similar when he found out Padme died. And he crushed every droid and metal object in that room. Now, mind you, those weren't Dark Troopers, but nevertheless, they're still droids and they're still made of metal. Star Wars metal, that is. Seeing as how Vader's powers were weaker right after he became a machine compared to when he was Anakin Skywalker fighting Obi-Wan, I wouldn't deny that Anakin could do that move and more given the right encouragement of anger. Anakin was powerful, but was he Jedi Knight or Jedi Master Luke Skywalker 5 years after Return of the Jedi, crushing Dark Troopers with the Force level of powerful? That's the question, and I don't think he was. Had Anakin reached this age without losing to Obi-Wan? Yes, he would beat Luke in the Force, no question. And again, Luke has trained for less years than Anakin, but he's trained without the limitations of the Jedi Order. Remember in Episode 2, Anakin claimed that the Jedi Order was holding him back, right after his mother died. And I believe this was true. I believe he could have been so much more powerful had they really understood how strong Anakin was and his full potential. Putting him in classes with other students who weren't nearly as powerful as him, or keeping him sort of in check with his powers, didn't allow him to fully flex and spread his wings the way that he normally could if, let's say, Palpatine trained him, or let's say someone else trained him who wasn't so dogmatically blinded by the new Jedi Order's laws and affiliation with politics. So Luke trained without the limitations of the Jedi Order. He learned from the ghosts, from the books, from scrolls, holocrons. He is more powerful in the Force not by nature, but by knowledge and expanding his horizons. Anakin was forbid from using certain techniques until he turned to the dark side. This is why I give Luke the Force power upper hand. Luke's abilities aren't confined to what the Jedi Council deems as righteous. He bends the rules a bit. He uses the Force for good, and that's the end of it. He doesn't let his powers to dictate his affiliation in the Force, but rather his choices. We saw Luke choke the Gamorrean guards in Jabba's palace. This would be considered a dark side power. This would be a no-no for the Jedi, as we saw Anakin did that in the Clone Wars. Luke used Force Crush against the Dark Troopers in The Mandalorian Season 2. This would also be a very questionable light side ability. Luke in Legends, and what I think has carried over into The Mandalorian, making it canon, at least I believe, is now using many aspects of the Force at his disposal, instead of just abiding by the Jedi's dogmatic view of the Force. This makes Luke a little more dangerous against a dark side Anakin or light side Anakin, as opposed to him just using light side powers. The two would fight their hearts out, each attack besting the one before. Anakin would use the Force to fuel his anger and his hatred, drawing upon his rage to make him more and more powerful. As Dooku stated in the Revenge of the Sith novel by Matthew Stover, Anakin's powers and heart were like a furnace, burning hotter and hotter. Anakin was like the Hulk. The more he fought, the more he stepped into the dark side, the more powerful he became, especially if Padme's life was on the line. But I also believe as he stepped into the darkness further and further, so did his eye of sight into his abilities. He became overconfident, which would in turn possibly be his weakness. I mean, that's what made him lose to Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan just basically had to wait for Anakin to make a mistake, because he knew that he couldn't actually flat out beat him. Luke would eventually become overpowered in this case if Anakin kept fighting and fighting. He would just grow in power and anger. Not to mention, Anakin was physically taller and bigger. Luke was shorter and smaller, albeit at this point much more level-headed and collected. Anakin had a mechanical arm, whereas Luke just had a mechanical hand. This would play into Anakin's favor. He would use his robotic arm to drive more power into his attacks. However, Luke has fought Vader, who is much more physically powerful than Anakin, so that nullifies. And as they both began to tire, Anakin's height and size eventually would play a role of dominance. However, Luke, continuing to be calm, would parry Anakin's strikes and let him tire as well. He would think the bigger they were, the harder they fell, and the slower they would be in comparison to him. Luke did fight Vader, after all, who was beyond 6'6", whereas Anakin, who was 6'2", and yeah, I know Hayden's only 6 feet, but Anakin is supposed to be 6'2", which isn't nearly as tall as Vader, but certainly faster, more fluid and agile. So who wins? I mean, this is probably the hardest analysis I've ever had to do. Luke would need to really worry about Anakin fighting longer and longer, assuming, there's no lava pits or anything like that, there's no high ground. The longer it took Luke to subdue Anakin, the harder and harder it would become for him to win. And not to mention Anakin's overall lightsaber speed. I think Luke would need to immobilize Anakin sooner in the fight if he wanted to win, just by sheer precision and calmness. But the more Anakin fought, the more his abilities would increase, along with his rage, and the battle would just become more and more difficult for Luke. This would be the only time that Anakin could actually win. Now, that doesn't mean I'm giving this fight to Anakin. I should also mention that I think Anakin's mentality of being the chosen one, the poster boy of the Clone Wars, and knowing he needed to win in order to save Padme's life would propel his powers tenfold as the fight went on. He truly believed he was the best, but this also led to his downfall. It makes you think you're invincible, and as we all know, nobody is. I think if we had Anakin at the start of Revenge of the Sith against Luke, Luke would win, but Anakin in the dark side after slaying the entire Jedi Order, orange yellow Sith eyes, and his need to save Padme resting on his shoulders would give Anakin quite the edge. But with all that anger would make him unsettled, and the more powerful he became, the more unbalanced he became, which is what led to his downfall. Luke would stay calm, cool, and collected the entire battle, and probably just defend himself until Anakin made a mistake. Not to mention, Luke fought Vader, who was more powerful in Return of the Jedi than Anakin was, albeit of course not being able to move as quickly. He was physically and force-wise more powerful, and Luke still got the upper hand. Now, there is something I want to mention about that. Vader wasn't really trying to kill Luke. He never actually was. So Luke fighting Vader isn't really ever a proper fair battle that we saw in the films, because Vader wasn't going all out. He was trying to turn Luke to the dark side. He was just playing with him a little bit and defending Luke's attacks, until at the very end when he got blindsided by Luke, and at that point Luke took the upper hand, tapped into the dark side, and got the best of Vader. Now, if Luke were to use some bits of the dark side as well, then it would be much more difficult for Anakin. So with all of this put together, Anakin being a better fighter, Luke being much more level-headed and being extremely strong in the Force at this time, I think it would essentially just make him a stronger version of Obi-Wan Kenobi. And for that reason, the final verdict is Luke Skywalker in The Mandalorian Season 2.
What?
And as hard as it is for me to say this, I think Luke in Mando Season 2 is basically a Jedi Master. I mean, Anakin is still an irrational, impatient fighter. He's much more gifted, he's more powerful potential-wise, but he's just not there yet. He hasn't had enough time to develop those powers. He's not as level-headed, and Luke is just so much more calm. And that really plays a huge role in a fight. Luke is like that sniper, whereas Anakin is like the shotgun. He's just volatile, he's insane, he's all over the place, he's just bleeding energy out of everywhere. Whereas Luke is focused. He knows what he's doing, he knows where to strike, and he knows when to strike. He knows when to be defensive, he knows when to be offensive. He has the power of the Force to guide him, and he has the abilities to take him through this battle. The only thing that led to Anakin's downfall against Obi-Wan wasn't his inabilities. He was much more capable than Obi-Wan and much more powerful, but it was his overall arrogance in his abilities, thinking that he is invincible, in that Obi-Wan underestimated his powers. And it was actually kind of interesting because Anakin tried to beat Obi-Wan the same way that Obi-Wan beat Maul. And this was going to be sort of a spit in the face to Obi-Wan, like, hey, I'm going to beat you at your own move. That's how good I am. And if you never caught that, well, now you know. Luke is really the most powerful being in the galaxy at this point. Now, Anakin is my favorite character in all of Star Wars. And I know you've heard me say I love Qui-Gon, I love Luke. Well, let me explain. Qui-Gon is my favorite for his personality. Luke for his overall story arc and his optimism. But Anakin, as a whole, is my favorite character. I think Luke would use his level-headedness to do what Kenobi did, but he's just, a much more powerful version of Kenobi, so it just doesn't really make sense for me to say that Anakin would beat him. Anakin would full-on just make a mistake out of his own arrogance, not because he was weaker or anything like that, but he would just make a mistake, he'd fumble. He'd just become too cocky and arrogant, and Luke would take the finishing strike. Let me know what you guys think of this fantasy battle, and let me know if you want me to do full potential Anakin versus Legends Luke sometime. We can also throw Starkiller in the mix too in some of these. If you disagree with my outcome, let me know in the comments below why, and I'll be sure to respond. If you want to carry this on over to the StarWarsTheory.com forums, please do that. I've linked the topic down below. I've already put the thread up on the forums. I hosted it, so go check it out, comment along with all the other Star Wars fans out there, and have a good discussion. Remember to keep it cordial and fun, and I'll be chiming in as well as to why or why not I think your answer is correct or incorrect. Let's have some fun with this. Thanks for watching this fantasy battle video. Put your suggestions in the comments below as to which characters should fight each other next. And I'll see you all in the next episode of Star Wars Theory. Until then, remember, the Force will be with you, always.